of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
Tonight, non-committal. The Trump-Xi summit ends with few concrete breakthroughs and a warning from Beijing on Taiwan. President Trump says he made no commitment on the island's future, and questions remain over what comes next for U.S.-China relations. We'll discuss with Senator Chris Coons later this hour.
And market tremors, global bonds sell off, and the S&P 500 tumbles the most since March. As fears grow, the war with Iran could drag on. Meantime, President Trump facing fresh scrutiny over more than 3,700 first-quarter stock trades involving big companies with business before his administration.
Plus, a Washington institution, Martin's Tavern, has long been a Georgetown backdrop for presidents, justices, and power players. And now, after a nod from Saturday Night Live, the storied D.C. restaurant is getting a fresh spotlight. Joe Matthew takes you inside this hour.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew. Just a couple of hours from now, President Trump set to arrive in Washington following a days-long summit in Beijing, meeting with China's Xi Jinping and bringing with him some of the country's top tech and business CEOs. President briefed reporters aboard Air Force One on his way home. Listen.
He doesn't want to see a movement for independence. He says, look, we've had it for thousands of years, and then at a certain period of time it left, that we were going to get it back. They had the Korean War, a lot of things happened, and all this. But on Taiwan, he feels very strongly. I made no commitment either way.
Made no commitment on Taiwan. The president adding he will decide soon on a planned multi-billion-dollar weapons shipment for Taiwan. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall joins us now live, still on the ground in Beijing with much more on this. Tyler, it's great to see you as the president makes his way home. It does seem that Taiwan rises to the top of the agenda as opposed to the trade deals that many expected.
It definitely did, Joe. In fact, Chinese state media, after President Trump had left here in Beijing, came out and said that Taiwan is the #1 issue for U.S.-China relations. Now, during this visit, U.S. officials made very clear that their policy regarding Taiwan, including that deliberate ambiguity about Taiwan independence, has not changed. But as you mentioned, President Trump remains non-committal about the future of a $14 billion weapons sales package that has been queued up for his approval. In fact, President Trump did say that he discussed in, quote, great detail with Chinese President Xi Jinping about arm transfers to Taiwan, breaking what has been decades long of diplomatic precedent to not consult with Beijing on such issues. Now, for context here, the U.S. did approve the single largest weapons deal to Taiwan back in December, amid now new questions about when this latest round of sales will be released. Taiwan, we did get some response from Taiwan earlier today, reported from Taiwan's Foreign Affairs Ministry, urging President Trump to move ahead with what has been precedent and to grant this mandatory approval for these additional sales. Really, Taiwan felt like that one big point of contention amid a summit that was relatively cordial, right? The big word that we kept hearing around here on the ground in Beijing was this idea of strategic stability from both sides. And it was that stability, though, that we saw, but we really didn't get that much progress in terms of tangible deliverables. Yes, we got that Boeing deal, though it did fall short of market expectations. We're still waiting on firmer details on what that will look like. But we didn't really get firmer details around other items that we were expecting, such as agricultural purchase commitments, whether or not Beijing is going to purchase more U.S. energy products, though both sides did say that those issues were discussed. Or what about NVIDIA's H200 chips? There was this expectation that maybe there could be a breakthrough there for the Chinese market, considering that NVIDIA's Jensen Huang was a last-minute addition to this trip. So a lot of big questions about some of those top issues, though Joe and Kaylee, both sides did confirm that they will look to establish a U.S.-China Board of Trade and a U.S.-China Board of Investment, essentially geared to help trade flow between the two countries. But at the end of the day, it's just that. It's a commitment to create those mechanisms, but it doesn't mean that those mechanisms are created just yet.
Well, so I wonder, for a lot of this, how much we'll have to wait and see if it's finalized in September when President Trump has Xi visit him at the White House.
That's a really good point, Kaylee. In fact, one of perhaps the biggest deliverables is that the dialogue is going to continue, which goes back to this idea of strategic stability, that the two sides are going to keep the conversation open. As Chinese state media confirmed earlier today that Chinese President Xi Jinping has appeared to accept the president's visit for a state visit in the fall, one of potentially 3 additional face-to-face meetings that we could ultimately see between the two leaders. In fact, we heard from China's foreign ministry earlier today saying that Chinese President Xi had, quote, agreed with President Trump on a new vision of building a constructive China-U.S. relationship. So the idea that they are going to talk about more of these issues, we heard the Chinese president talk about the idea of opening up the Chinese market more, though we didn't really see those tangible steps taken quite yet. So a lot of big questions here that still remain, but one thing that is emerging is that they are going to keep that dialogue open.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting live from Beijing all week for us. Thank you so much. And joining us now for more analysis after President Xi warned that Taiwan could lead to, quote, clashes between the U.S. and China is Becca Wasser, defense lead for Bloomberg Economics. And Becca, as we emerge from this summit, I wonder if we should be understanding the term clashes to just be simply rhetorical clashes, or if we could be talking about real physical military clashes here. What would that look like?
So first and foremost, Taiwan has been the biggest flashpoint in U.S.-China relations for a very long time. And we've heard threats like this from Xi Jinping in the past, in part because that's his form of deterrence, trying to make it so that the United States will not come to Taiwan's aid if Xi Jinping decides that he wants to unify with the island and try and take it by force. But those threats have not been effective thus far, and we've seen continued support from the United States, even with President Trump's recent comments, which do align with the longstanding policy of strategic ambiguity. But as you note, these clashes could potentially occur in the future, and that is the thing that the Pentagon has been preparing for quite some time. And a lot of the war games that I ran for the Pentagon were actually looking at a potential U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan.
So you've been spending a lot of time staring at this island. What kind of options would the president be facing if he did decide to defend Taiwan in the event of a mainland takeover?
It would be an all-out effort from the United States if that decision were to be made. And so all of the military forces that we've seen being brought to bear in Iran, we would see that and perhaps even more with Taiwan. And it would require a great deal of air and maritime forces, as well as supporting forces, in order to try and help Taiwan defend from a potential invasion, which, you know, Taiwan has really been ramping up their own indigenous defense efforts in help with U.S. arms sales. And that's something that the Pentagon has continued to push, even amidst some of these, you know, questions about this next tranche of arms sales. But it would be very difficult for Taiwan to be able to hold the line alone without support from the United States and perhaps other regional allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, and do we have the capability to do that, at least if this were to happen in the near term, given everything that we have expended in the Middle East, knowing a full replenishment of those munitions could take, what, years?
Years. That's absolutely right. And you see China definitely paying attention to all of those expenditures of munitions, including those high-end missiles that would be so relevant in the early days of a potential U.S.-China conflict. And so they're watching this, and it means that the U.S. is depleted its readiness for this potential conflict and some of the other crises that they could face in the future around the globe. So it's definitely an open question. That said, what the U.S. has is a lot of military might, more than most countries. And so even if this were to happen in the near term, which I don't personally think is in the offing, you know, the U.S. could still help Taiwan mount a potential defense if the president were to make that decision.
Becca, thank you. I'm sure this is not the last time we'll be talking about this. Becca Wasser leads our defense coverage at Bloomberg Economics, and we appreciate the analysis as always. Jay Powell's last full day at the helm of the Fed today. Word just breaking now from the Federal Reserve announcing Powell will be chair pro tem of the Fed until Kevin Warsh is sworn in following his Senate confirmation earlier this week. Fed Governors Michelle Bowman and Stephen Myron saying that the pro tem's term should be limited to a fixed period of time. The stock rally, meantime, hit a wall today in the form of sharply higher interest rates, with Kevin Warsh in mind, and oil prices resuming their climb above $100 a barrel. Let's turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who puts this all together for us from New York. Hey, Nora.
Well, it's really been a risk-off day on Wall Street as people really try to digest what's going on with this prolonged war in the Middle East between the U.S. and Iran. But additionally, we got two hot inflation prints this week that investors are really pricing in. And it's really causing this concern that the Federal Reserve could potentially leave rates higher for longer. And so we're seeing that being digested. We're really seeing that showing up in both the Treasury market and the equity market. So we saw Treasuries tumbling today, yields on the climb. Take a look at the policy-sensitive two-year yield. That's what I'm looking at right now at about 4.1%, up 5 basis points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.6%, up about 11 basis points. And the 30-year up about the yield on that up 5.1%. Trading higher by about 8.9 basis points. So you're really seeing this playing out in the bond market. Also, activity on equities, clearly seeing the impact. The S&P 500 down 1.2% today. The worst day since March that we've seen for this major index, and tech stocks certainly a huge part of the story here. The tech-heavy Nasdaq 100 down by 1.5%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average lower by more than 1%. You did see a mass exodus from a lot of these tech names, so you saw a lot of pressure when it comes to semiconductor stocks. I've had my eye on the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, down 4%, almost 4% nearly today alone. And so names like Intel, Micron, NVIDIA, any name that has any sort of exposure that people see to be riskier, we're seeing all those names really selling off. But when you look on the broader scope of the week, we are still seeing the S&P 500 seeing its 7th straight week of gains. The S&P 500 holding at a record. But of course, people still thinking about what is going on with oil. So also looking at Brent crude right now up about 3.3%. Trading at $109 a barrel. So you're still seeing the impact really infiltrating the oil market as people really think about how this could potentially be inflationary in the long term and what it means for the market more broadly.
All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, thank you so much. Coming up, how Capitol Hill is evaluating the success of President Trump's trip to Beijing, when Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware joins us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Coming out of this week, you heard the president today talk about the Boeings and hundreds of Boeings being purchased by China. We already have a soybean deal with them from our prior meetings of 25 million metric tons a year over the next 3 years, and we expect to also see an agreement for double-digit billion purchases of ags over the next 3 years per year. We want to focus on non-sensitive goods. We think we should be selling them, things we think we should be buying from them, trying to facilitate trade in that area, and then from there, we'll be able to interact with our Chinese colleagues and negotiate with them.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer speaking with Bloomberg earlier today about the deals secured during President Trump's trip to Beijing, though we're still light on details and official announcements. And joining us now with his reaction is Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, who serves on both the Senate Foreign Relations and Appropriations Committees. Senator, welcome back to Bloomberg. I wonder if, in your mind, sir, there were successes to be found in this trip, in this dialogue, or you think the president is returning to Washington tonight with the United States on a weaker footing relative to China?
Well, Kaylee, I think he went to China on a weaker footing, and as a result, he encountered Xi Jinping, who was forceful and clear, really pressed his concerns about Taiwan, that President Trump didn't push back, actually was willing to discuss our arms sales to Taiwan, to respect some of China's expressed concerns, was a big step back from what our position has been since Ronald Reagan. And you just played Jamieson Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, suggesting there might be some deals. My core concern all along has been that Trump would trade chips for beans, more purchases of soybeans by China in exchange for licensing more advanced AI chips. When Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, joined Trump at the last moment, I was concerned that Trump would continue to advance his ill-advised licensing of the export of advanced AI chips. And I'll just remind you, Kayleigh, and your viewers for a moment, that Trump's in a weaker position because of problems he solved. He picked a tariff fight with China, and then China played the critical minerals card, and we had to back off. He went into a war of choice in Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz is closed to all countries except China. Iran just started releasing Chinese ships laden with petroleum. So we're in more of a bind than China is. So I don't think this was a big success, but at least I'm relieved there wasn't some obvious giveaway of any core American interests by President Trump.
Senator, thanks again for coming on. Tell us more about the $14 billion in weapons that have been slotted for Taiwan. The president would not commit one way or the other on this. If the U.S. has an issue here, do you believe that President Trump will spike this deal?
I certainly hope not. We should proceed with arms sales to Taiwan. Look back to the Taiwan Relations Act. The Senate, the Congress has had a strong role in ensuring that the United States, as part of its one China policy, deals directly with the People's Republic of China, but also provides for the defense of Taiwan. And our long-standing position that we that we are not trying to advance Taiwan independence, but we are also not going to allow for a forceful takeover of Taiwan is a delicate position that we've held for decades. And in the last year or two, Xi Jinping and the People's Liberation Army has crossed the midline of the Taiwan Strait over and over and over, has been rehearsing a potential invasion or blockade, and has projected more force into the South China Sea than at any point. So an increasingly well-armed and aggressive China needs a counterbalance to maintain the status quo across the Taiwan Strait.
Well, Senator, do you believe that a Chinese invasion or attempted takeover of Taiwan is inevitable? And do you think that that timeline may have been accelerated by the events of recent months, our war in the Middle East and this summit and non-committal dialogue, as we understand it, coming from President Trump?
Look, I think the Chinese are constantly probing for weakness and for whether or not we will stand by our partners and allies in the region. When Japan's prime minister made a statement about Japan being willing to come to Taiwan's defense, and Xi Jinping and Chinese leaders directly threatened and insulted the prime minister of Japan, the Trump administration's failure to stand by our treaty ally Japan in that exchange was noted as a moment of weakness by China. I do think that Xi Jinping has made perfectly clear his intention to reunite Taiwan with the mainland. And our goal should be that that be only a peaceable conversation, not one by force, and that an ongoing dialogue about cross-strait relations needs to be one that is respectful and appropriate, and that we do not encourage or allow China to further build out its constellation of illegal and not internationally supported facilities and positions in the South China Sea. Look, we have a number of interests, but our most important interest in some ways is continued freedom of navigation through the Taiwan Strait, through the South China Sea, and that's an interest shared with our treaty allies like the Philippines, like Australia, as well as many other countries in the region, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the United States has been a critical guarantor of a peaceful and stable Western Pacific for decades. As China continues to try to project force, this was an important summit, and our president staying silent on whether he will go ahead with arms sales to Taiwan, I think was a critical step backwards for our interests.
Well, it's one strait or the other, it seems, Senator, because the president suggested that China was prepared to help the U.S. reopen the Strait of Hormuz. We got some mixed messaging on this, and it's not clear that China agrees with the president on that posture. But here's what he told reporters on the way home on Air Force One. Let's listen.
We did discuss Iran. We feel very similar to Iran. We want that to end. We don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. We want the straits open. We're closing it now. They closed it, and we closed it on top of them. But we want the straits open, and we want them to get it ended.
It would obviously be in China's interest to reopen the Strait, Senator, but do we have any reason to believe that Xi Jinping will help Donald Trump in this matter? And just more broadly, what has China learned from this experience in closing the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, they've learned that a blockade is an incredibly powerful tool, and there's no reason for us to believe that they're going to actively help pressure Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to other countries' ships in addition to China's ships. And frankly, I'll remind you that recent public reporting strongly suggests that China and Russia are helping Iran rearm and are considering sending further armaments to Iran. So Russia has been a close partner with Iran. Iran has provided critical Shahed drones for Russia's daily bombardment of Ukraine. And it is those Shahed drones that are currently being used by Iran to attack civilian shipping, to attack oil and gas facilities among our partner and allied nations in the region, as well as to attack our bases and our embassies. President Trump should be learning the lessons of the Ukraine war and embracing Ukraine, the world's leader in producing interceptors for these Iranian Shahed drones. Our partners and allies like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, they are engaging with Ukraine and purchasing interceptors from them. When I had Secretary Pete Hegseth in front of me in my role as the ranking Democrat on defense appropriations this Tuesday, I kept pressing him for an answer to two questions. Mr. Secretary, what's your plan to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to civilian shipping? And why not embrace Ukraine, invest further, partner with Zelensky and Ukraine, because they have the upper hand in developing drone technologies and counter-drone technologies that could help reopen the Strait of Hormuz and help us transition to the future of warfare. He did not have a good answer, in fact, any answer to either of those questions.
Senator, we just have a minute left here, but there were reports emerging yesterday about the CIA Director John Ratcliffe's visit to Cuba. And I wonder if you have any understanding of what that visit was intended to accomplish and what it may mean for whether or not you think we could see kinetic activity there, too.
Well, according to press accounts, that was an opportunity for Director Ratcliffe, to make an offer of humanitarian assistance of about $100 million. And the Cuban leaders countered by saying, if you want to help reduce the hunger and the blackouts in Cuba, maybe you should partially or fully lift your blockade. It's an indication that there's more pressure being felt by the Cuban regime. And look, I'm no friend or supporter of the Cuban regime, but I do think we need to be mindful of the widespread humanitarian crisis on the very large island of Cuba and the potential consequences of a fall of the Cuban regime after the Trump administration shut down most of our ability to deliver humanitarian aid when they killed USAID last year.
Yeah, they've run out of fuel in Cuba. From his view on the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. It's great to have you back, sir. Thank you for being with us. On Balance of Power, alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The integrity with which he led this institution and really protected its independence during a time when the president mounted a series of unprecedented actions, firing a governor, undertaking a criminal investigation. So I think the chair's legacy is really going to be around preserving the independence of the Federal Reserve. And I think he actually gives Kevin Warsh a much stronger position to start from than might have been.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we spoke earlier today with Lael Brainerd, the former vice chair of the Fed, about Jay Powell's tenure as head of the central bank. It is his last day as chair. Kevin Warsh now set to inherit a concerned bond market, you might say, and rising inflation data that we saw evidence of this week. Joining us now with His reaction is Christopher Smart, managing partner and founder of the Arbroath Group. He's also former special assistant to the president, the National Economic Council in the Obama administration. Christopher, it's great to see you. Welcome back. You know the landscape here. Oil prices are surging. Gas is through the roof, $4.52 a gallon. Interest rates today surging, pulling stocks lower. So when's the first rate cut?
Well, that's a trick question if I heard one on a Friday afternoon. I think the markets are clearly looking at all of the pressures coming from energy prices. They're looking at the cumulative pressures on inflation that were there before the war in Iran. And they're saying it's really going to be tough to hit that 2% Fed target with any cuts anytime soon. And I think now the markets are pricing in nothing this year and maybe not even next year at this stage. So I think Kevin Warsh is facing perhaps the immediate wrath of the president, but really there's just no way with a straight face that he can come in and try and talk to his colleagues credibly about rate cuts at this stage.
What about the credibility of the rate hikes conversation, Christopher? How high is that bar?
I think it's still high at this stage. I mean, I think there are a lot of moving parts, as any central banker would tell you, in that central bankerese that they quickly adopt when they get into office about, the data. We're still looking to see what's coming into view. And I think for any central banker, the best answer they can give is, right now we're going to do nothing. The shocks from oil price spikes really are meant to be temporary. What really is concerning and what I think they're all going to have their eyes on are things around inflation expectations, which have been edging up, the stability in bond markets, and then the data in terms of what kind of weakness we may see in consumer spending, which has been holding up pretty well, as you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what is going on in the bond market, Christopher? Why the freak out today? This is something that could have taken place at the beginning of strikes against Iran, but 2 months have gone by. And now suddenly today you've got a 2-year above 4%, a 10-year above 4.5%, and a stock market that can't handle it.
Well, that's the mystery of markets. I mean, I think, as you say, the kinds of things that we're seeing today and using as explanations for this sell-off are the kinds of things that, frankly, you have been kind enough to invite me onto your program and talk about for the last many weeks. Right. The CPI print earlier this week was certainly not a surprise. The continuing standoff between Iran and the U.S. is with no apparent way out is not a surprise. The fact that Xi Jinping couldn't or wouldn't, to my mind, it's really hard to imagine that he really can pressure Iran to change its course any better than the United States can right now. That's not a surprise either. But these are things that happen in markets, right? They all sort of accumulate over a period of weeks and days, and then all of a sudden people kind of look at each other and go, ugh, this is really bad. And I think that's what we're seeing on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah. Well, what was your overall reading of the president's trip to Beijing and how investors should think about it when it seems that the success was really in the fact that there was dialogue and at the very least the trade détente seems to be intact. There's clearly pushing stability in the relationship. Is that enough?
Well, I think it's plenty when you think back where we were last fall or even last year, where we were mounting tariffs of 100 to 125% on one another, where we had actually found each other's most sensitive pressure points, with the Chinese cutting off for a time access to critical minerals, and the Americans cutting off China's access to our most advanced semiconductors, and then both sides kind of backed away from that. I think the fact that this was a good summit symbolically, is sort of the diplomatic equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. The fact that the two leaders want to play up the fact that they have a good personal relationship, that's all good. It's not going to solve the underlying structural issues that divide the two countries. But I think it also gives us now a scorecard between now and the next 129 days, which is when Xi Jinping is due to land in Washington for a bilateral summit. And we'll see whether the readouts that, Ambassador Greer, President Trump, and others have given about more orders, a board of trade or a board of investment, will we see those things take shape over the summer months that we can really judge this summit based on the progress that may or may not come out of it? We've seen a lot of these announcements before, particularly when the U.S. announces something and China doesn't. I think we have to be particularly skeptical.
Hey, Christopher, what's going on at the Fed? Did you see this headline today? It broke right after we came to air. The Federal Reserve Board naming Jay Powell chair pro tem. Republicans, the administration at least, are unhappy about this. Should they just name him shadow chair?
Well, I think he's going to be a presence on the board, but I think he's somebody who respects the institution so much that he doesn't want to overshadow, I think, Kevin Warsh's arrival. And I think he'd probably personally like to be out of there as quickly as possible. He's there because of this continuing threat of an investigation that the Justice Department has said it's ready to open up again if the Inspector General finds wrongdoing. I think, as you heard Lael Brainerd say, Jay Powell has been an extraordinary chair through a lot of difficult times, and I think it's probably a nice honor for him. I don't think he gets a pay increase. I don't think he gets a better office. But I think it's a reflection of his defense of the institution that the institution is recognizing at this, unprecedented moment.
And finally, Christopher, I want to ask you, we got financial disclosures for the first quarter in terms of President Trump's trading filed with the U.S. government Office of Government Ethics yesterday. Some 3,700 trades in Q1 alone. At least $1 million in a number of stocks purchased, including NVIDIA, which, of course, can be sensitive to U.S. policy and things like export allowances. So there's some questions here about the number of trades, the companies that are involved in this, knowing it's coming against a backdrop of people who have found some incredibly lucrative, well-timed trades in things like oil futures around this war in Iran. It's all creating a question around transparency in U.S. financial markets and whether or not some people are armed with information that others simply do not have access to. Do you think that's undermining to the case for U.S. financial markets in some way?
Yes. I mean, it's nuts, right? That people in office are able to, and it's not really just the president, right? It's members of Congress that are trading on maybe not inside information, but clearly advanced views of what's going on or what may come soon. And in any case, they shouldn't be trading on in companies in areas which they have oversight. So I think it undermines credibility in markets. It certainly undermines credibility in government at a time when, of course, Washington is not, anybody's favorite institution in the country right now. So I think it really is problematic, and I hope that at some point Congress will come to terms with this and recognize that part of the problem is on their side of government, but also figuring out a way to ensure that the president is much more transparent and not able to benefit financially from being in office. So certainly when I was at the White House, many of my colleagues, all of my colleagues, were covered by very strict rules around this. And the fact that, there have been these shortcuts, I think those need to be cut off.
All right, Christopher Smart, managing partner and founder of the Arbroath Group. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you.
And joining us now for more on that and other stories we're following is our political panel, Bloomberg politics contributor and Republican strategist Rick Davis, a partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Democratic strategist Jamie Jackson, founder at Vantage Global Media. Welcome to you both. There's a lot we want to speak with you about, but Rick, I would love your take, too, on this entire conversation, not just around the president's trades, but some of the trades we have seen that seem almost perfectly timed with policy announcements by the president in which people have made a lot of money. And as Christopher raised, this isn't just at the executive branch level we have these questions, but Congress, too. My question is, are we actually ever going to see anything done about it?
Well, it's the kind of thing where outsiders who are running against the system politically are really going to get a lot of attention for this. It's a classic, you get to Washington, you buy into that culture, you're trading off of insider information, you're part of the back scratchers patrol. And so people who are running against incumbents this year are going to have a blast using this issue because the normal voter, who isn't related to any member of Congress and getting any of that information for their trades is going to be just shocked by the fact that this kind of thing is happening in Washington.
Yeah, shocked. There's gambling going on here. The president purchased NVIDIA, Jamie, February 10, just a couple days before the company announced a huge deal with Meta to fill its new data centers with NVIDIA chips. He also purchased stock in Microsoft and Amazon just before the Pentagon announced deals to deploy their technology in their classified computer networks. What did Democrats do about this?
Well, that might explain why NVIDIA president was seen running to Alaska to meet with the president to go on the trip to China. I mean, I think this tracks with what we've seen coming out of this administration. I mean, for example, you have the president's son-in-law, who is very involved in negotiations with Iran, who has a lot of business dealings in the Middle East. Yeah. But this is a matter for Congress to conduct oversight.
You do have a lot of bills out there, the stock trading bans that would include the administration. Does this move it over the line?
I think it could, but, the point has been raised that members of Congress trade as well. So there's a lot of conflicts of interest involved, but also the Office of Government Ethics. This is also a matter for them to look into as well.
Well, and of course, the composition of Congress could very well look a lot different after November in the midterms, and certainly so when we think about the new maps that are going to be in play, as we've seen redistricting across a number of states, including in the South, where they're writing out Democratic seats in some states completely. Jamie, I wonder how you view the Democratic response to that. Obviously, states like New York looking to make moves in 2028, but more broadly, how do you compete in that kind of changed landscape?
Well, the recent decisions from the Supreme Court, as well as the Virginia Supreme Court, have been very disheartening. I mean, that's very clear. But I think it's important to note that the Virginia Supreme Court did not make their decision based on the merits and substance of the actual maps and of the actual fairness issue that was on the ballot initiative. It was simply a matter of how the Virginia legislature went about the sequencing of the actual vote. And so I think Democrats continue to fight. As we know, this was a Republican-led redistricting arms race that started in Texas, led at the direction of the president, and Democrats continue to fight for voting power.
Well, it's on to South Carolina today, where the governor is apparently going to take a swing at this, Rick Davis, and try to eliminate the seat that's held by James Clyburn. This is going to be a situation not limited to this cycle, right? We're going to continue redrawing maps after November leading into 2028.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I don't think there's going to be much of a contest on the vote in this special session in South Carolina. Yeah. Vast majority of Republicans are going to eliminate that one minority-majority district that exists in South Carolina. And nobody's going to put VRA back together in anytime soon with this Supreme Court. So yes, if you think redistricting is the top line issue in politics today, wait till the next cycle. I hate to look beyond midterms, but there's absolutely reason, just like we were talking about, to have Virginia get right back in there, because they were stopped not by the fact that they didn't have merit to redistricting, but the timetable was upsetting. And that applies to a lot of states right now. So, of course, this is a new element in political battles, is to, if you don't like the ground you're given to play on, change it, redistrict and see what else you can do.
Well, on South Carolina, just quickly, this is not just any seat we're talking about. It's Jim Clyburn's seat. Do you think he could win even in a redrawn map?
I do, because let's look at what we're dealing with here. We're still in this unauthorized war of choice with Iran. Inflation is at 22 levels. Gas is up. Cost of living is up. There's still a major affordability crisis in this country. And quite frankly, Republican leadership in Congress is running out of available legislative business days to get any real wins across the aisle to the American people. And so while there have been some setbacks on the Democratic side with regard to redistricting, I still think that Democrats have a fight on their hands.
Interesting. Rick, you were still of the mind, though, I believe, that you can, as far as this midterm cycle is concerned, even if Republicans have a 6 or 10 seat advantage on the maps, that the historical implications here in a midterm election and the story that Democrats have to tell, all of the issues that Jamie just highlighted, could still make it possible for Democrats to win the House.
Yeah, I think we're looking at, something like a replay of 2018, where you could have in excess of 30, 35 seats switch. And when you're doing that, you look at the South Carolina example that Jamie's talking about. And let me tell you, that could be turning out to be dummy mandering. You could water down enough, regular Republican districts by trying to divide up, Clyburn's seat that you wind up net loss. I could see a situation where we could lose 2 seats in South Carolina while we're trying to eliminate 1.
We just have 30 seconds left, Rick. The Louisiana primary is tomorrow. What are the odds that Bill Cassidy, the incumbent senator, can even make it to the runoff?
Right now, I'd say he's likely not to make it to the runoff. I mean, in all the survey data I've seen, he's coming in 3rd out of 3. It's become a referendum on him. And the other candidates are better positioned with the Trump voters that are in vast supply in Louisiana. So I worry about that because, honestly, it's these kinds of changes in electoral politics in Louisiana that open the door for Democrats to come in and make a case.
Boy, I'll tell you, it's going to be interesting to watch all of this. Rick Davis and Jamie Jackson, we thank you both for a great panel. I guess the lesson, if you're a Republican, don't cross the president. Coming up, president's power brokers and a surprise SNL cameo. We sit down with the owner of Martin's Tavern here in Washington to talk about the history behind one of D.C.'s most storied restaurants. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Washington, D.C. is home to some of the most important political deal-making in the world, but not all of it takes place at the White House or Capitol. For generations, Martin's Tavern in Georgetown has been a gathering place for presidents, lawmakers, journalists, and insiders. And last weekend got a fresh national spotlight when Saturday Night Live opened its show with a skit about the D.C. institution. So I went across town to meet with Billy Martin, the 4th Billy Martin to own and operate the restaurant, to talk about its history and its staying power.
When I woke up in the morning, I didn't know what had happened, but my phone had 1 million messages on it. I'm like, what is going on here? So it was very, very, I mean, woke up and when I saw the clip, it was just unbelievable.
Isn't that something? You had the Martin sign right there, though. Now, does Pete Hegseth come here as a regular, or that was just for TV?
I think that was for TV. Okay. Pete hasn't been here. Kavanaugh's been here, but it was a long time ago, I think, when he was going to school. Oh, boy. And but Kash Patel has been in.
No kidding.
Yeah, he's been in. He enjoys the food here, so
he behaved himself?
Absolutely.
Okay, so Martin's, of course, is an institution here in Washington, and people have been coming here long before SNL ever got it in the cold open. And I'm fascinated by the product that you sell, because you sell history just as much as you sell food, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things is that, over the years, we don't put any pictures on the walls of the famous people that come in like some restaurants will do, because we want Martin's to be a comfort zone, a place where people can come and get a great meal. Mm-hmm. But as it happens, as it has, over the years, many things have occurred here that has made us into sort of a great political place to come and hang out.
Well, it's a museum when you walk around here. I mean, elements of the New Deal were hammered out in the back cove there. There was a certain proposal made at this booth behind us?
Yes, John F. Kennedy proposed to Jackie Bouvier in our booth here.
The Rumble booth, also something that JFK used for a pretty important project.
Yes, we have a little seat there called the Rumble seat. It's a very interesting half booth, and couples love to sit there. I like to sit there many times by myself. Okay. And yes, John Kennedy drafted a lot of his inaugural speech there.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Right between them, the Nixon booth, which is not lost on us. The fact of the matter is, though, this is a neighborhood restaurant when it comes right down to it. You just happen to be in a very profound neighborhood.
Absolutely. And, I think Martin's, we were one of the first places here. I mean, if you go back and look, when we opened it after Prohibition ended, Georgetown was not the neighborhood it is today. And so it's been just a great time to watch how we have grown with the neighborhood. And Georgetown it's a very unique neighborhood with very rich history. But it's, my father used to say, Georgetown's like a pendulum. It swings up and it swings down.
How about that?
And right now, wow, Georgetown is on the major upswing.
Yeah.
It's really happening here now.
Well, it's just nice to have my sneaky bar here where I'm not going to run into anyone from work, because none of Trump's people like drinking as much as I do. Wrong!
It's not just getting a pint and a meal here at Martin's. You've actually seen real politics, real policy come together in this room.
Oh, absolutely. This room in the dugout, back in the dugout, a lot of the New Deal was sort of formulated in there.
Yeah.
And then that was in the 30s, of course, when we first got open. And then as we fast forward into the 40s, we had Alger Hiss and Elizabeth Bentley, a whole spy thing going on in Martin's Tavern.
Wow.
And then in the 50s, we had the Chief Justices coming down, debating or discussing Brown versus the Board of Education.
Wow.
It was just, so many fun events have happened over the years.
Yeah, well, that really underscores the history of the place beyond its age.
Exactly.
And you're still making history now.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah, we are. We did. SNL came in and has used our tavern for a skit.
Yeah.
What more can you ask for? I think just so many fun things have happened.
Fantastic.
Does this bar take cash?
They do take cash, by the way. And huge thanks to Billy Martin. Can you imagine the fourth Billy Martin to run that establishment and his whole team down there? They're great people. And I can't believe he missed SNL live. He woke up to it the next morning.
Yeah, pretty incredible. I want to know what the actual number of texts on his phone was. It had to be in the hundreds, I would imagine.
It's never a great feeling when you wake up and see that 100 people tried to call you. It's usually not going to be good news. For him, it was pretty great.
Definitely. You going to Martin? It's a Friday night. You going to Martin's after the show?
Yeah, let's go right now. I'd say we do that because we've got a big trip to prepare for next week.
We do.
You all packed up?
Yeah, we're heading to Atlanta next week. It's primary day on Tuesday in Georgia, and we're going to have that covered for you with special coverage Monday through Wednesday. Obviously, a number of races that we're focused on, including what has turned out to be a pretty messy Republican Senate primary, as they're looking for a challenger to the incumbent Democrat, Jon Ossoff.
That's right. He's going to be all on his own on Tuesday night, trying to figure out who he'll be running against. And, of course, on the gubernatorial side, it's a lot of names, some of them familiar that we'll be telling you about. And we've got a Trump endorsement on the line in that race as well. Yeah. But we'll talk more broadly about the economic themes right now in the city of Atlanta. We'll be joined by Atlanta's mayor and try to get you prepared for a number of other primaries that'll be taking place on Tuesday night. So it's just part of our coverage here at the outset of this primary season that you'll be able to get used to between now and November. A lot of themes we talk about every day here in Washington. We'll take them on the road.
Yep, including redistricting, for example. Georgia didn't pursue it for this year, but they are going to take it up in 2028. So that's something that we'll be digging into as well. So make sure to join us for that coverage.
Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. We survived another week, and we're heading for another big one here. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you in Atlanta. This is Bloomberg.